Today's talk is the third Dr. Peter Stanek Memorial Lecture on the Japanese occupation of China in the War in the Pacific. Previous iterations of this lecture were given by Daqing Yang, George Washington University, and Micah Muscolino of the University of California at San Diego. The lecture's eponym, Dr. Peter Stanek, earned his PhD in mathematics from the University of Chicago. After retiring from a long career in academia and industry, he devoted his energy to seeking redress for the atrocities committed against the Chinese and other people during the Japanese invasion of China. He served as president of the Rape of Nanking Redress Coalition, which was based in San Francisco Bay Area, and he was the international president of the Global Alliance for Preserving the History of World War II in Asia. This lecture has been endowed by Dr. Jean B. Chan, who is Emerita Professor of Mathematics at Sonoma State and was married to Dr. Stanek. I want to express my gratitude to Dr. Chan and her son, who are both here today. Your gift will inspire and educate for many years to come. So our speaker today is Rana Mitter, who is the St. Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University. Prior to Harvard, Professor Mitter was on faculty at the University of Oxford. Since the moment I learned of Jean B's gift to the university, I've wanted to include Professor Mitter in the lecture series. He is so prolific that even this historian of the Soviet Union had heard of him. Professor Mitter has published numerous books on China's experience in World War II. The most recent of them, the one you're probably most likely to find on the bookshelf in the bookstore, is called China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. Professor Mitter is also a public intellectual. He writes often for non-specialist audiences. You're likely to find him on the op-ed pages of newspapers and in journals like Foreign Affairs. Finally, I want to note that Professor Mitter is a fellow of the British Academy, which is one of the highest honors for a British scholar. So with that, I'll turn the podium over.
I'd like to start with a few words of thanks, if I may. First to Professor Mitter for organizing and coordinating the talk today. It's a pleasure to be able to be here and to also be organized by a very distinguished historian of the Soviet Union, again, who's worked not least on the Soviet presence in Antarctica, I was just speaking to him earlier, which is definitely a sign of someone who can spot both an intriguing, unusual, and important topic. Too few historians can do. So, Stephen, very pleased to be here in your company. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jean B. Chan, who is the cause, in a sense, of us all being here today, having endowed the lecture in memory of Dr. Peter Stanek. And it's a great honor to be here, along with, as it were, in the sort of succession to two wonderful friends and colleagues, Professors Daqing Yang and Michael Muscolino, who I've known for many years. And it's a pleasure to be after them. I'm aware that the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, generally speaks for around 3.5 hours. I would not try and emulate that particular record, so I'll stick to 2.5, shall I? Or perhaps slightly less than that today. So let me start with this picture here. And as the caption will tell you, but as I hope you may recognize from the context, this is Tiananmen Square at the heart of Beijing, the literal as well as metaphorical center of Chinese politics. And this particular parade, held on the 3rd of September 2015, was notable because it was a first, an unprecedented occasion. And I'll say why that is in just a moment. I would say that that occasion was the first. Last year in September 2025, we had the second such occasion. What was that occasion? Well, it was the commemoration of an event of historical importance at the center of China's most important political space, Tiananmen Square, seen, of course, amongst other things, of course, of the horrific killings in 1989, most famous for that, perhaps, but also, of course, for being the center of the political demonstration of might and power of the Chinese Communist Party ever since the square was built in the 1950s. So having big demonstrations in the center of Tiananmen Square is not that unusual. But what was very unusual about this particular occasion in September 2015 was that the occasion being commemorated with this huge military parade was neither an occasion linked to the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, which took place, of course, in 1921, nor was it linked to the founding of the People's Republic of China, the current state run by the Communist Party of China, which was established in 1949. This was the first occasion that such a parade took place commemorating an event of global significance, but not specific to the Chinese Communist Party or its state. And that was the ending of World War II in Asia. In other words, the 70th anniversary of what is known even now in many places as VJ Day, Victory over Japan, at the end of World War II. And as I mentioned, on 3rd of September last year, 2025, commemoration was held in the same place, in the same sort of way, also in Tiananmen Square, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. But this was the first occasion that it was thought important to put forward this particular commemoration. And the question I have, and I hope to answer by the end of my comments today, is why the Chinese Communist Party would decide to institute a new public commemoration, something surrounding the history of World War II, having not done so explicitly for the 70 years since the end of the war that had preceded that particular event. You might say that 2015, slightly over 10 years ago, is a long time to wait when it comes to commemorate an event of such importance in such a central place. And the reasons for that, I can tell you a great deal about the complexity as well as the importance of this World War II experience in the China of today. Even at a moment now when the vast majority of China's population with themselves have gone through that particular experience, having been, of course, born many years after it ended. It links, of course, to some of the most important geopolitical events in the world today, although I will say that that's not the only reason I think that World War II is important. Just to give one example of what that sort of geopolitics might mean, is here we have a picture of one of the 8 small islands, outcrops really, uninhabited, that sit in the sea, the East China Sea, between China and Japan, about halfway between the two. In Chinese, they're generally known as the Jiaoyu Islands. In Japan, they're generally called the Senkaku Islands. And Taiwan, separately known as Jiaoyu Tai. In any language, their name spells trouble because they have been the source of huge geopolitical conflict between, or potential conflict between China and Japan about who actually has sovereignty over these islands. In fact, some of the significance of the islands, as I'll go on to say, relates to events during World War II itself. But all we need to note now is that they still remain controversial in the 2020s, more than nearly a century after they first came into dispute between the two sides. And relationship between China and Japan, these two neighbors, remains very fraught, perhaps more so than it has been for decades. And ironically, the relationship between China and Japan in the post-Cold War period has been much more fraught than it was during much of the Cold War, even though thankfully it has not reached the level of all-out global war, which of course had marked the relationship between the two countries in the 1930s and 1940s. Sitting at the heart of some of these geopolitical questions of memory and of international confrontation sit the events of World War II. And World War II is, of course, an immensely well-known event even now, some 8 decades after it concluded in North America, in Europe, in Japan, in many, many parts of the world. In China, however, it's worth noting that although World War II has been commemorated, of course, for many years, its experience has not been necessarily very widely known in the outside world. And it's worth remembering a few of the headline statistics and numbers that give some idea of the huge size, scale, and scope of China's wartime experience during those years. For a start, China was in the war against its main adversary, Japan, for a longer period than any of the other countries that would become part of the Allied partnership in World War II. Europe, of course, plunged into war 2 years later in 1939, but in China and Japan went to war in 1937, and the war had been raging in Asia for 2.5 years before Europe joined the fray. The Soviet Union, of course, did not enter the war until 1941, June, Operation Barbarossa, and the United States famously entered it only after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So the 8-year period of war between 1937 and 45 is a long one in terms of that global conflict. Then the number of deaths caused by the war also became a hugely and horrifically immense number during that period. I'm using that phrase caused by war because not all of the deaths were caused in direct combat, even though those numbers, numbering probably something close to 1.5 to 2 million, were more than enough to make for a horrific record in their own right. But we have to include, for instance, events such as the terrible Henan province famine of 1942 to 43, in which estimates suggest that 3.5 to 4 million people died of starvation. Although the deaths were not caused by the direct assault of weapons, they were nonetheless the product of a famine that almost any analyst would suggest would never have happened had it not been for the wartime situation. And there are plenty of other circumstances, bacteriological warfare, the destruction by the Chinese government of the dikes on the Yellow River in 1938 that drowned or killed many hundreds of thousands of people, all of which add up to unimaginably large numbers of dead. Larger by a factor of 10 or more than the number of those who died were the number of Chinese who became refugees in China during those years, with some 80 to 100 million Chinese becoming internally displaced within China, or in some cases even spreading out to Southeast Asia during that time. Bearing in mind the population of China was some 600 to 700 billion at that time, this was a very large proportion of the entire population at that time. So compared to even the undoubted and huge suffering of many people in Europe, and indeed many who came from North America and elsewhere to fight in the war, sheer devastation wished upon or forced upon China during these years deserves greater attention in international scrutiny than it has generally managed over the last few decades. And I'll go on to explain some of the reasons that I think that wartime experience of China has been relatively much less well examined than the equivalent in many other parts of the world. Before we do that, let me take just a few moments to outline the major trajectory, the events and the chronology of World War II in China. I won't do it in huge intricate detail because clearly that would take hours and probably give you a rather broader level of detail than you necessarily want in a relatively short lecture. But I think it's worth just remembering some of the key events before we go to the detail of what has been remembered and what has been forgotten during those wartime years. So essentially, the outbreak of war between China and Japan in 1937, like any such war, did not come out of the blue. It did not come from nowhere. Instead, you could argue that it is the product of the ultimate confrontation between two major ideological forces that shaped East Asia during the late 19th and early 20th century. At least, let us say, for the 50 or 60 years before that outbreak of war in the 1930s. One of those forces was, as it were, sort of centered within China itself. And that was the rise of Chinese nationalism. A growing sense that China had been invaded and occupied in the Opium Wars of the 1830s and 40s, and then by the increasing depredations of major imperial powers, the British, the French, the Americans, the Japanese, even at one point the Austro-Hungarians, who achieved one of the smallest colonial possessions ever seen anywhere in the world, which was a small number of streets inside the northern Chinese city of Tianjin. So a great deal of imperialist effort was used in the late 19th, early 20th century to try and conquer parts of China, either in terms of full territory, like the island of Hong Kong, down here on the south, or else in extraterritorial special legal and commercial rights, which many foreign powers had during that time. And this led to a pushback. First of all, in the fall of the last emperor of China in 1911, the establishment of a republic, which was supposed to provide a kind of stronger, more stable China, but ultimately fell victim to different warlord groups within China fighting each other. So much of China was characterized by civil war during these years, the 1910s, 1920s. But as part of that, many of China's younger intellectuals, thinkers, and military leaders came together in a often ill-defined but very strongly felt movement that China somehow had to get its act together and push back against the forces from outside that were seeking to divide it up, or in a phrase at the time, carve it up like a melon. So the rise of young students and intellectuals and thinkers as part of China's nationalist movement also gave rise, gave rise to new military academies and the establishment of new political parties, in particular the Chinese Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, often written in Western romanization as Kuomintang. You may have seen that phrasing. First under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, then when he died, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, the leader who would fitfully, in a fragile way, partially reunify China in 1928, and also the growth of a party which started off as an ally to Chinese nationalists and then ended up a few years later as their deadly rivals, Chinese CCP. Not at that point led by Mao, who would become the supreme leader only somewhat later, but already in the 1920s and 30s, beginning to develop their idea of Soviet influence, military training, and rural revolution that would create a kind of new force of in China's countryside that would overturn the existing society, which they felt was unjust and unfair. So these and other forces came together in the early 20th century to create a new sense of Chinese national identity, an ideology of nationalism that, amongst other things, pushed back against the idea that foreigners should have any kind of veto role or imperial role within China's own territory. In other words, to create a sovereign Chinese nation state that did not really exist. So that's one ideological force, the rise of Chinese nationalism on the mainland. That came up against one that I immediately realized I placed just off the right-hand side of the map. But I don't think this educated audience will need to be told that here you would find the islands of Japan. So Japan on the right-hand side becomes the scene of the other great imperialist, ideological force at the time, which is Japanese imperialism. Japan also goes through its own sort of nationalist movement in the 1860s and 70s, known as the Meiji Restoration, which, unlike in China, led to a very rapid and quite successful modernization with a new army, a new education system, a new German-influenced constitution, a parliamentary system, but also the growth of a Japanese national desire for an empire of its own, to be like the British and the French and the Germans. And the most natural place from Japan's point of view was to expand onto Chinese territory. And Japan's growing militarized empire took various possessions. First of all, the island of Taiwan, here off the coast of China, was taken as a Japanese colony in 1895 after a short war with China. It would remain a Japanese colony all the way till 1945. And over time, then there is a war with the Russians up in 1904, 1905, up in Manchuria in the northeast of China. That leads eventually to the Japanese victory, which leads to their possession of the city of Dalian, as it now is in southern Manchuria, off the coast, as you see there. So if I manage to do two hands at once, yeah, there we are, Dalian. At that time, Dalian, Japanese imperial port. And beyond that, in the 1920s, in particular, in a more informal way, Japanese troops, which begin to be stationed up here in Manchuria, make their way further and further into northern China in a sort of informal placement, projecting power without ever claiming full sovereignty, but basically arguing that because of Japanese economic interests in the area, that they have a special right to be there. So that's why over the 1910s and 20s, more and more Japanese troops could be found on Chinese territory, leading to a situation which eventually would lead to a blow-up. The tensions between China's new nationalist government, established in 1928, and the Japanese rumbled along in the 1930s. 1931 was a big game changer because at that point, a Japanese-sponsored military coup essentially took over most of Manchuria here in the northeast. Technically, it was claimed to be an independent state called Manchukuo, but nobody, including the League of Nations, actually believed this at the time. In practice, it was a Japanese client state. And that alerted many Chinese nationalists to the idea that they could be next, the rest of China could become quite vulnerable. Chiang Kai-shek, of course, the Chinese leader, was also very concerned with the Chinese communists, the CCP. He had broken with them and massacred many of them in 1927 and 28. But they had embarked on what became a legendary event in their own history, the Long March of 1934 to 5, when they went from Jiangxi province down here in southeast China through a sort of roundabout route through western China, ending up in Shanxi province here in the northwest, where they made a base. And there they might have stayed at least for some time, except that the increasing threat of the Japanese presence in northern China led to a very uneasy agreement by the summer of 1937 between the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, including Mao, not just Mao, but Mao was certainly part of it by then, to ally with each other in a united front against what was seen as the greater menace of the of the Japanese potential invasion of China. And then on the 7th of July, 1937, the moment of decision arrived, because a very, very small skirmish outside Beijing, then known as Beijing, between local Chinese and Japanese troops blew up into essentially an all-out confrontation between the two societies. The original incident in which the Japanese and the Chinese clashed with each other was so minor that it was almost farcical. Essentially, although we don't have the full details even now, a couple of Japanese soldiers who were garrisoned outside Beijing missed roll call because apparently they had stepped out to basically relieve themselves. They'd probably drunk too much food, needed to use the bathroom. And having missed roll call, they were scared about being, called out for it by their senior officer, so they disappeared. Senior officer thought the Chinese had captured them and killed them, raised a diplomatic incident, which led to a confrontation with the two sides. And this led to the Japanese demanding, at the governmental level, demanding a lot of territorial concessions from the Chinese, which the Chinese nationalist government refused to put forward. So essentially, a little bit like the Archduke being shot in Sarajevo in 1914, in August 1914, one very small incident led to a much larger continental war breaking out within just a few days and weeks. And that then set the fuse burning for what would become an all-out war between the two countries for the next 8 years. In the initial period of confrontation between the two sides, Chiang Kai-shek, having decided to confront the Japanese in North China, opened up a second front very quickly in the summer of 1937 at the great port city of Shanghai, here on the eastern coast of China. Not least because more foreigners lived in Shanghai than any other city, and this was a good way to exhibit the Chinese were finally going to fight back against the Japanese. The Chinese were unable to control or keep control of much of northern or eastern China. And by the summer of 1938, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had retreated 800 miles up the Yangtze, you see the blue line here, it's Changjiang, which is the Yangtze River. They had retreated up the Yangtze River 800 miles to the city here of Chongqing, known in the West as Chongqing at the time, which would be the temporary wartime capital of China for the next 8 years, actually until mid-1946, in fact. And China's resistance under the nationalist government remained based in Chongqing for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, the communists are sort of scattered in other parts of northern China and elsewhere. And by 1938, China is divided, not evenly at all, but broadly into 3 parts. Eastern and parts of northern China that are occupied by the Japanese, bits of northern and central China that are under the control broadly of the communist movement, and the south and southwest, known as the Great Rear or the Great Interior, Dahaofang, where the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek basically retreated in exile to try and win the war. For the next 4.5 years, the nationalist government, along with their communist partners, resist the Japanese assault on China, which, although it gets quite quickly to control most of eastern China, never actually manages to make its way into the rest of China. So the nationalists are able to defend this part of China. And the other game changer, of course, is the increasing encroachment of the global war between the Allies and the Axis, which finally leads to pressure on the Japanese to try and end their war in China. The Americans pressure them by embargoing their oil. President Roosevelt does that in 1940, 1941. And eventually that leads to an event which I think is globally known, which is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. An attempt to try and knock out Western power, British, French imperial power, and American support in a kind of series of lightning strikes in Asia to end the war in China and elsewhere before the Americans can fight back. And as we know, it doesn't quite work out that way. The war in Asia then basically continues all the way from 1941, all the way till its very sudden ending with the invasion of Manchuria and the atomic bombings of summer 1945. But during that time, China and its resistance, continues to be central to the war in Asia. And many of those figures I gave you before, the millions of deaths, the the tens of millions of refugees who are in occupied China, who leave occupied China for the unoccupied parts during that period, are part of that wider story. So that's a sort of very brief, promising that was quite brief, outline of the trajectory of China's war between 1937 and 1945. And let me now say a little bit more about what happens on the ground during those wartime years, before we then move on to come back at the end to where China is in terms of remembering and thinking about that war in the present day. So I mentioned very briefly that in the summer and winter of 1937, Chiang Kai-shek's government is unable to hold eastern China. The Japanese presence is too strong. They're pouring in troops through occupied Korea, which is yet another Japanese colony at this time, and from Manchuria. And they make their way into eastern China, and that's pretty much all under Japanese control. So the nationalists make their way here to Chongqing in the southwest of China, in Sichuan province. So this then becomes the base for China's resistance to Japan during this period. And Chiang Kai-shek's strategy, the strategy of the nationalist government and its armies to basically work out how they can, as they put it, trade space for time becomes central to their idea. In other words, they know that they can't defeat the Japanese on their own. The Chinese armies aren't well trained enough. They don't have the right kind of weaponry. The situation is not unlike the invasion of Ukraine in our own period. But they also know, like the Ukrainians, that victory is unlikely without overseas assistance. And the problem the Chinese have at this point is that nobody wants to give them official military assistance in that particular moment against the Japanese. Everyone's very sympathetic towards the Chinese, but they don't want to actually provide troops or even that much finance. So the British won't help, the French won't help, the Americans won't help. China, for this period, is essentially fighting on its own. And Chongqing is a good place to choose if you need to have a capital city that's going to be defensible on a temporary basis. It is very accessible by river. It's on the confluence. As you see, there actually have not one but two rivers, the Yangtze and the Jialing, going the other direction. But it's very hard to invade by land because it's on cliffs. If you've ever been to Chongqing, even if you haven't, you may have seen pictures. It is known even today as a shanchang, a mountain city, because you basically have to, today you could ride motorbikes to basically go up and down the very steep streets. In those days, the sedan chairs in which workers would, take the richer and more middle class people up and down the streets, which were incredibly steep, in these sorts of palanquin type chairs, because it was the only way to get past the fact that it was a very difficult city to engage with. So if you're an invading Japanese army, it's a hard city to take. But war in the mid-20th century provided one other way for the enemy to attack that was, of course, very much part of the new way of warfare in the 20th century. And that was, of course, the air raid. Now, China was not the first theater in which terror bombing from the air was being used. The Spanish Civil War, which was happening about the same time, 1936 to 39, was one of the first conflicts in which aerial warfare, bombing of civilian targets, was used on a regular basis. And in fact, in the progressive vocabulary of the time, China and Spain were both thought of as parts of the same pushback against fascism. Many Western figures very much involved with that kind of movement, such as the British poet, English poet W.H. Auden, Christopher Isherwood, the Dutch filmmaker Joris Ivens, the great American photographer Robert Capa, went to Spain to essentially support the Republican side against General Franco, and then traveled to China to essentially do the same thing for the nationalist resistance against the Japanese, which is ironic in a sense, because I think if you ever asked him, Chiang Kai-shek, who was an authoritarian dictator, would actually be much more sympathetic to Franco's conservative nationalism than he would have been to the Republican cause. But clearly he was willing to get support from any way he could manage. So Chiang Kai-shek's defense of Chongqing by land was manageable, but it was much harder to resist what came from the skies. And Chongqing became the site of some of the most intense and devastating air raids anywhere on Earth during that period. Many people, not least those who know the history of the war in Europe, will be aware of the Blitz, which destroyed large parts of London in 1940, or indeed in later history of the way in which German and Japanese cities were destroyed by firebombing. There is still less historical memory in the outside world of what, even now, in the city itself, in Chongqing, is remembered collectively as Da Hongzha, the great bombing of Chongqing during this period. Between 1938 and 1941 in particular, repeated air raids over the city reduced it, as you see here, to rubble in many cases. Incendiary bombs, which were used alongside regular bombs, also set large parts of what was a largely wooden city on fire. And in one particularly poignant moment, the 3rd and 4th of May 1939, something like 38 consecutive sorties of Japanese bomber aircraft repeatedly looped over the city, landing endless numbers of bombs, both regular and incendiary, on the city itself. And the reason I say it's particularly poignant is that apart from the horror of the experience itself, those of you who know Chinese history will know that that date, I think not accidentally, was exactly to the day, 20 years after the 4th of May, 1919, the date of probably the single most famous nationalist student demonstration in Chinese history. Even today in China, if you talk about Wu Si, May the 4th, you don't need to say the year. Everyone knows it's May the 4th, 1919, when students demonstrated in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the Tiananmen, in central Beijing, wanting to create a stronger nation for China. 20 years later, that nation was essentially under fire in retreat in Chongqing as Japanese air raids destroyed large parts of the city. Another shot that you have here of one of the city's streets reduced to rubble from above. And when people discuss the nationalist government at the time under Chiang Kai-shek, there are many indictments, many of them entirely justifiable, I have to say, about what went wrong with that government. Corruption, allowing hyperinflation of prices, lack of organized government that enabled proper governance to take place. All of these were perfectly correct and justifiable complaints against the government at the time. But it's often forgotten quite how difficult it was for any government, particularly a relatively impoverished and financially deprived one like that of Chiang Kai-shek, to try and run government well at a time when this sort of experience became an everyday occurrence in wartime Chongqing. One of the very few saving graces, and it wasn't much of one, but it was something, was that because Chongqing has a topography that leads to very, very thick fog, it meant that winter was safer. It was much harder for Japanese bombers to find the city, from the skies and bomb it when the fog was in full flood. Whereas in the summer, when the fogs had essentially dissipated and in the bright sunshine, the city below was basically a sitting target for Japanese attacks. So the emergence of Chongqing as a place that had to take this sort of air raid experience on a regular basis was something that shaped people's everyday lives during those wartime years. Nonetheless, Chongqing, rather like London during the Blitz, did not simply sit there passively. And we have evidence from the time that shows some of the ways in which people reacted. So one of the things that was done with governmental assistance at the time was the creation of new forms of industrial mobilization. I mentioned before there's tens of millions of refugees who flee within China during that time. Not all of them came to Chongqing, but many, many hundreds of thousands did. The size of the city grew massively to over 1 million people during the wartime years. And although we know that the experience of refugees would last till 1945, they had no idea of that at the time. That the war might last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or forever, as far as they were concerned. And so setting up basically industrial enterprises, again, in the desperately impoverished and bomb-strewn situation of wartime China, became a major imperative. This is one example of young refugee women spinning yarn, as you see here, as part of that kind of cottage industry provision of employment for refugees. There's also an attempt to try and bring different parts of society, the mobilization of society more broadly, into coordination at that time. So, of course, young men are being conscripted and sent off to the front to fight the Japanese. Young women, as you see here, are in a torchlight nationalist parade that basically is showing their defiance to the Japanese during this time. Troops are being sent off on troop trains to the front, not from Chongqing in this case, which wasn't actually on the railway at the time, it is now. But in central China, again, the rapid mobilization of troops, as it happened also in Europe, became an important part of getting troops around the country during an increasingly industrialized period of warfare. And even the youngest members of society are brought together in total mobilization at this time. So here you have young cadets who are being issued with these sorts of hoes and tools to learn how to undertake tasks that are necessary for national victory, particularly when young men, again, are being sent off to the front. Women and children are being recruited in many places to try and create a workforce that will help to keep wartime Chongqing and the wider nationalist zone operating in the face of Japanese occupation. So these tales were ones that caught the attention of much of the world at the time, including the United States. So one of the most famous journalists in the history of 20th century America, Theodore White, Teddy White, who was chief correspondent for Time magazine, became very well known for the dispatches that he sent back, which were read, of course, by the millions of readers of Time magazine back in the US at the time. So this Chongqing experience became one that was well known to American and indeed European readers, as well as within China itself. Why then does it remain so little known in the present day, whereas events of World War II, such as the London Blitz, such as the American campaigns in the Pacific, such as the events, of course, of D-Day and everything that follows, are so well remembered? Is it just because China is less well known than the Western world in terms of its history? Well, I think that's part of it. But actually, there's another and more internally Chinese reason. And that has to do with this gentleman here. So, Chairman Mao, we mentioned him before, and now we will get to him. So, the last time we met him, Mao was at the end of the Long March, about 1935, up there in northwest China in Yan'an. And he also makes excellent use of World War II. Remember I said that there's a truce between the nationalists and communists who are fighting each other because they're both having to fight the Japanese. And that gives space and time for the communists to expand their own movement. It's a very small, quite raggle-taggle movement at the beginning of World War II when the Japanese invade. By 1945, when it ends, the Chinese communists have trained something like 2 million troops under their command, and also have about 1 million members of their own party by that stage. So it's grown into a huge political force in its own right. Mao himself does not start World War II as the primary leader, but he certainly ends it that way. The rectification, Zhongfeng movements of 1942 to 44 essentially cement the ideological rule of Mao as the supreme leader within the party, and mean that by the time the Japanese are defeated at the end of World War II, he is in prime position to take over the governance of China, as well as the party. As I think is well known, but it's worth saying that once the war with Japan comes to a sudden end in the summer of 1945, the Soviets invade Manchuria, the Americans drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war comes to an end much more quickly than anyone expects in summer of 1945. China's two warring major parties, the communists under Mao and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, go to war with each other during this period. And essentially the civil war between 1946 and 49 rages across China, ends, of course, with the communist victory. They take over the mainland of China. They're still very much in charge today, of course. And the nationalists flee to the island of Taiwan, around 2 million of them, where they have remained ever since. Their descendants have, anyway. So the mainland of China, within 4 years, has switched roles. In 1945, beginning of that year, Japan is America's most deadly enemy. And, well, apart from Nazi Germany, but certainly by the summer of 1945, Japan is America's most deadly enemy. And wartime China, nationalist China under Chiang Kai-shek, and with the communists also supporting, is still a clear American ally in Asia against the Japanese. Just 4 years later, the situation has flipped. Occupied Japan is now one of the major Cold War assets for a newly emergent post-war United States in Asia. And China has become the world's most populous communist state and is now an adversary of the United States. So the two great Asian powers, Japan and China, swap sides in American eyes during that period. They also, of course, swap sides in Chinese eyes. And that means that when Mao takes over and initiates the People's Republic of China in 1949, he also rewrites history. And the history that's written becomes one in which his party, the Chinese Communist Party, is the only one that essentially has any significant role in defeating the Japanese. The Americans are written out of the story. The Brits were there too. They are written out of the story. And most of all, the Chinese nationalists
the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, the enemies of Mao and his communists, of course, but also the single most important battle force against the Japanese during World War II. The communists were very important against the Japanese in terms of guerrilla warfare, in terms of a few set piece battles, but in terms of the major battles of World War II against the Japanese, Parazhuang, Changsha, Hanyang, Shanghai. These are battles fought by nationalist troops, not by communist troops. None of that story is told in Mao's China. And that's one of the reasons that all of those stories and pictures that I've mentioned there, the Chongqing story of China's temporary wartime capital, this is not part of China's wartime narrative at all for decades. Not in the 1950s, not in the 1960s, not in the 1970s. In other words, it's not until the 1980s, when politics has changed in China, that the stories I've told you about Chongqing and the nationalist period began to be heard again in the mainland. There are several reasons. Chiang Kai-shek had died in 1975, Mao had died in 1976, so their rivalry is no longer central to politics. The mainland of China under Deng Xiaoping, the kind of reformist leader, wanted to try and get Taiwan back. So some things don't change, as you've gathered. And they thought, not unreasonably, that being a bit nicer about Taiwan's nationalist leaders, who are still very much in power on the island, and their wartime effort against the Japanese might be a good way of currying favor. And another thing, China had gone through the horrors of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. You can see a picture there. That picture of Mao I've chosen is of him, as you see there, wearing his armband as a Red Guard, a Hongweibing. It's basically the idols of millions of young Red Guards in Tiananmen Square in the 1960s. So the Cultural Revolution ends with Mao's death, essentially. And it was such a traumatic, such a horrific period that China's leaders want to make a new start. And so they're looking for a patriotic message that is not about class warfare and the destruction of the Cultural Revolution. What can they find? Well, they go way back into the pre-1949 past and say, well, what about World War II? Because whether you're a communist, whether you're a nationalist, doesn't matter. If you were Chinese, you were fighting against the Japanese, and that patriotic story brings you together. Well, they don't mention, by the way, just to make that story complete, as it were, is that, of course, a significant part of China was under Japanese occupation. And there's at least one significant leader, Wang Jingwei, who actually was working with the Japanese, and many of the Chinese were fighting for him as well. But that part, of course, is not mentioned in the revisionist history either. So this led to an odd, an interesting phenomenon that started in the 1980s, and is still going on today, but it waxes and wanes, which is the sort of strange historical dance done by the Chinese Communist Party of today, in which they have to partially to acknowledge the wartime contribution of their old ideological enemies, the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, and somehow square the circle, thread the needle of saying, actually, these guys were quite important in fighting the Japanese in World War II. But of course, the moment the war was over, they were ideologically terrible and we had to defeat them. But okay, during that earlier period against Japan, they did have a certain patriotic role. And that opened up space, what you also see today, which is a new and broader and more complex collective memory of World War II in today's China. So there are a few examples. Let me just show you some examples of what I mean by that. And the way in which World War II, 80 plus years after its end, continues even now to have a significance in shaping contemporary Chinese identity. So this book here, again, if you can read Chinese, 一个人的抗战, One Person, One Man's War of Resistance Against Japan. When I bought this book, about 20 years ago now, I thought at first, just looking at it, it was a memoir, one person's memory of being in the war. And by the way, War of Resistance, the War of Resistance of the Chinese people against Japanese aggression is the kind of jargon term that's used in China today for China's World War II against Japan. And in fact, it turns out it's something much more interesting in some sense than a memoir. It's a catalogue, a very unusual museum that's outside Chengdu in Sichuan province in southwest China. And it's a museum of artifacts of China's soldiers in World War II. But all of those soldiers are nationalists. They're Kuomintang soldiers. They're not communist soldiers. There's a separate part of the museum that does deal with that, but the curator has pointed out quietly that the Nationalist Party is much more interesting to visitors. And one of the reasons is that the Chinese nationalist zones that fought against the Japanese and were never occupied, particularly in southwest China, were never communist strongholds. And so because they were old nationalist areas, they were not allowed to tell their story through most of the Cold War under Mao. It was only in the 80s and afterwards that museum displays and catalogues like this could be put out there. Or this, going to Great Interior. This is a story about refugees, evacuees. There's a picture of them from the book at the front cover, who go as children or young men and women upriver from Nanjing, Shanghai, the cities of China's great eastern seaboard, up the Yangtze to Chongqing and elsewhere. These stories were not told, again, during the Cold War publicly, because these people had not gone to the communist areas, places like Yan'an. They'd gone to the nationalist areas like Chongqing. And so they were seen as politically incorrect in the post-war era, and the stories were suppressed. Until the 1990s, when some of these historians, some of whose names you can see there if you read Chinese, Su Zhiliang and others, go and do long oral history interviews with people by now in their 70s and 80s, but who remember going upriver, fleeing the Japanese in the 1930s and 40s on riverboats, those steamers like that Mincheng steamer that you see right there. And some of the interviewees told Su and the other historians, we don't fear dying, we know we're getting old, our time is coming, but we were very afraid until you came along that we would never get to tell our stories. So this ability of people to tell their own personal stories was a sort of unexpected consequence of the Communist Party allowing slightly more political leeway to their old enemies, the nationalists, in terms of hoping to get closer to Taiwan. Another example, the Great War of Resistance, not of the Chinese people, but of the people of Sichuan province in particular. In other words, one of the nationalist stronghold areas that previously had not been allowed to put up, for instance, statues of the unknown soldier like this one. And one of my favorite examples, a TV show from a documentary from actually the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II. Shown, you can see, if you don't read Chinese, the initials in the middle are CQTV, not CCTV, so not China Central Television, but Chongqing Television. In other words, in the early 2000s, 2005, I guess, this documentary was being shown on the TV station of the old wartime capital. And the title gives it away. It's called Kangzhanpeidu, Temporary Capital During the War of Resistance. And it's a reminder to the wider world, but also the rest of China, that during World War II, there were not 3, but 4 great Allied capitals: London, Moscow, Washington, D.C., and Chongqing. And here is the, it's been rebuilt since then, but the sort of early version of a war memorial, a kind of anti-Japanese memorial placed in the center of Chongqing. For the interest of historical accuracy, I should point out that the Chongqing Liberation Monument, as it now is not in fact twice as tall as the US Capitol building. Picture would suggest, but you get the point. So this rehabilitation of the old nationalist history has become part of that wider remembering of World War II in areas that were previously forbidden and even now are very politically sensitive. This isn't kind of universally permitted, but sit in a sort of complex gray zone in terms of where personal and local memory has allowed a certain amount of leeway in China in a way that perhaps the national level Beijing story still doesn't quite tell. It also gets manifested, World War II, in various aspects of contemporary culture as well. And again, just a few very quick examples, so we can do lots more, but time constrains us. This movie, released in the year 2010, East Wind Rain. It's a spy thriller. It's quite a fun spy thriller. It's about the secret underground Chinese communist group that's got Japanese intelligence about the upcoming Pearl Harbor attack, managed to smuggle it through to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, but being an American, he just ignores it, and Pearl Harbor happens anyway. It's a great piece of adventure. It bears no resemblance to any historical accuracy whatsoever. about this. I have to say, it's not unknown for American films about World War II to be a little light with the truth as well. So this is not exclusively Chinese. But the point is that it gives China in this story agency, not just as a victim, but as a country that was doing something practical in terms of trying to push back against the wartime invasion. More recently, this was just last year, in fact, this movie about one of the most notorious horrors of that period, the Nanjing Massacre of 1937-38. I'm sure many people will know the deaths of many, many tens of thousands of people in the occupied city during that time. It's been a regular subject of films, some better than others, but this one I think got pretty good reviews last year. The Nanjing Photo Studio is literally the Chinese title, Nanjing Jiaoshanghua. Dead to Rights was the slightly dodgy English translation, but this film was basically about that particular period. It shows that even 80 years later, there's still box office in terms of China's popular culture dealing with this highly traumatic wartime event. Obviously, in this case, very much focused in terms of anti-Japanese feeling. It also feeds into international relations. Otherwise, I haven't shown you a picture of Chiang Kai-shek. So here is one on the left-hand side. And here is a very, very, I think, symbolically important picture of him sitting alongside, obviously, globally significant figures. Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, in the middle there on the left. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister, of course, sitting in his rather fine white safari suit. And on his left-hand side, or right-hand side where we're sitting, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Su Meiling, Wellesley College graduate and fluent English speaker, who was essentially Chiang Kai-shek's ambassador to the wider world, particularly the United States of America. He didn't speak any English, didn't generally get on well with most, with a lot of foreigners. Su Meiling, his wife, was very, very good at liaising with Americans in particular. But this moment becomes important because it's the first moment where a Chinese leader sits not as a victim of imperialism, but in equal standing, the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the British Empire. This is a moment when China is under huge assault from the wider war against Japan, but also beginning that journey onto the global stage at the center. This picture, in a sense, is symbolic of the moment a little later on when China will become one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. It's also the case that I mentioned those islands back at the beginning, the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. Today, China's claim on those islands derives from the communique signed by these 3 gentlemen at the end of the conference in late November, early December of 1943, in which they talk about islands being restored from Japan to the Republic of China. And to this day, China argues that those islands should be China's by rights because of the protocol signed there. The fact that it was their mortal enemy, Chiang Kai-shek, who signed that particular communique has not stopped today's Chinese diplomats from arguing that the Cairo communique still has validation in the present day. So much so that a movie was made in 2015 about the signing of the Cairo Declaration to make China's point about possessing those islands in a kind of pop culture format. It's a rather odd film anyway, though well worth seeing. As you see, President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Chiang Kai-shek. In the movie version, Joseph Stalin, Chairman Mao, Winston Churchill gets to be there as well. In case you wanted, the guy in the middle, Chinese guy, is not Chiang Kai-shek. That's He Yinqin, who is the commander-in-chief of Chinese forces in China at the time. And just for curiosity value, the actor who plays Winston Churchill in this film is in fact an American. So if you're ever worried about cultural appropriation, it's pretty good example. So China's territorial claims, the South China Sea, very much valid. Sorry, careful about that. China's claims to the South China Sea, which are still very active today, whether they're valid or not, it's very much up to your point of view, whether you're looking from Beijing, from the Philippines, or elsewhere. There'll be many legal arguments about exactly that question, so very active. But deriving, again, from the post-war settlement in terms of nationalist China, which is the country that actually puts the claim in. And once again, you have an example of Chiang Kai-shek having put forward claims, whether it's at Cairo or in the South China Sea, which today is People's Republic of China, happily takes on board and uses in international law, while also claiming that the previous Chiang Kai-shek government was, of course, illegitimate and had to be defeated by the communists in the Civil War. One last example, I would say, as we come to near the end, of how history is also reappropriated. In the era today when China and Russia are much closer to each other, you will find that this particular set of events, when Soviet fighter pilots defended the skies above Shanghai for a period in 1938, are now very much at the forefront of Chinese war memory of the period. Much less mentioned is the fact that Stalin actually kept the Soviet Union neutral for most of World War II in Asia, in essentially 1940 and 1945. But this particular incident, which was real and historically absolutely important, of Soviet fighter pilots aiding the nationalists, is very much brought into play at this time. As you see, it's a Polikarpov Soviet fighter jet, but with, not jet, but with Chinese nationalist colors painted upon it. Let me finish with my own visit to Beijing just a year ago, where it was fascinating to see the main museum of the World War II experience in China, which has been built, it's now been there for about 30 years, just outside Beijing, at the Marco Polo Bridge, the very site where the war between China and Japan broke out on the 7th of July, 1937. And today, there are many messages that China puts forward in that museum, which are really not so much messages about the war itself, but about the present day. One of them is about China's entry into international society. The museum makes the case very strongly that China's strong presence in the United Nations today is a direct inheritance of its wartime sacrifices against Japan during World War II, which is again part of a wider argument about China taking a bigger role in international society. The implied criticism, not stated, but very much implied, is that as the United States steps away from that kind of post-war UN settlement, China may want to take up that particular space. And also, just referring to this picture, we have the growth of propaganda around the Sino-Russian relationship in the present day, using again the World War II experience as a way of suggesting there's a linear continuity between then and now, even though, as I'm sure many will know, there was a very, very vicious split between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, when the two sides essentially split off from each other in the 1960s. So that's by way of reminders, going back at the end to that Tiananmen Square parade that we mentioned in 2015, and of course we had the repeat of that 10 years later, just last year in September 2025, that although World War II is certainly history in China, and much of it, including the terrible suffering of the Chinese people, millions of deaths, tens of millions of refugees, the destruction of the infrastructure that was painfully built up in the 1920s and 30s, all of that history is under-examined in the wider world and should be remembered. At the same time, in some ways, China is quite typical of many of the other belligerents in World War II. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, Japan. The legacy of World War II is still relevant in many ways to contemporary politics. And so it is true in China. China remembers its own war history as history, but it also remembers it as current affairs. And understanding the important difference between what is historical accuracy and what is political presentation is an important task for all of us who want to engage, of course, with China and the world as it is, also want to make sure that our own perceptions of how history is used are underpinned by accurate, rigorous, and historical examination. When the West gets it wrong, we should make that clear. When China gets it wrong, we should make that clear. And getting the two sides to understand each other's history as well as their present is one of the most urgent tasks we have before us in the present day.